U.S. Representative Thomas Massie entered Congress in November 2012. After serving as Lewis County Judge Executive, he represents Kentucky's 4th congressional district that stretches across northern Kentucky. I think it's 280 miles of the Ohio River that he represents there. And in Congress, Congressman Massie serves on 2 committees, the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and the House Judiciary Committee. He's a graduate of MIT, a very smart man, but I think most importantly, he lives on a cattle farm in his native Kentucky with his wife and high school sweetheart, Rhonda, and they have 4 children. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Thomas Massie.
It's great to be here today. I want to start out with what I'm not. I'm not an expert on Ukraine. I've never been to Ukraine. I've never been to Russia. Which brings me to the other thing I'm not. I'm not a stooge of Putin. And it was actually Henry Kissinger said in 2014, he said, vilifying Vladimir Putin is not a foreign policy. It is an alibi for the absence of one. So anybody that tries to, if you've tried to engage in a rational conversation about this, you've probably at some point in time been called a stooge of Putin or a tool of Russia. And I reject that wholly. Those people should be disallowed from adult conversation. I want to begin this speech with where I think this is all going to end up. I think it's going to end up similarly to where it started. Putin had some demands for Ukraine, and it's probably, he wanted Ukraine to promise to not join NATO, to take that out of their constitution. I believe that's probably something that will happen. He wanted independence for the eastern regions, and he wanted basically a neutral Ukraine itself. But in the process, thousands of people are going to die. There's going to be a lot of money spent, a lot of lives wrecked, a lot of infrastructure to rebuild. So how did Putin get put in this position? Why did he react this way? I'm not saying that America is to blame. Only Putin can be to blame for that. But what are the things that we've done that could have avoided what ended up happening? Let me tell you a story about Eastern Kentucky that happened in Eastern Kentucky with me. So I built my own house, and this story is to inform you of sort of where I believe Putin is strategically. I built my own house in Eastern Kentucky. I logged the logs. I bought a sawmill. Built this thing from the ground up. It's off the grid. My personal philosophy is to be energy independent and food independent, and I think that would be a good goal for the United States to achieve, because there's a lot of externalities when you start buying those basic essential things from somewhere else, and you don't know what's happening in those somewhere else places, and then it becomes a reason to get involved somewhere else. So I think independence is a good thing. But in building this house, I had to employ some labor. I couldn't do it all myself, so I had this cadre of in-laws and outlaws. My wife's brothers worked in construction, and they were able to help me with the things I didn't know how to do. And then the outlaws, one of them, his name was Stid, and he was an alcoholic, but he was a functional alcoholic, and he had an addiction to prescription pills, but he was able to manage it. And in a city, you might have called him homeless, but Stid always found a home to live in. And so there was always a roof to stay under. And every day I would go to pick up Stid to come and help build my house. And he was fearless, but he weighed 120 pounds wet. He was part Native American. He was not afraid of heights. And I picked him up one day, and he clearly had broken ribs, a black eye. He looked like he had been run over by a truck. And I said, Stid, I don't think you should work today. You don't look right. Do you want me to take you to a hospital? And he said, no, I'll be all right, Head. He called me Head for some reason. He said, Head, I'm going to be fine. I said, well, you got to tell me what happened to you. And he said, well, yesterday when I was working for you, I hid my whiskey under the mattress. And my roommate, Brian, now Brian owned the house, but Stid euphemistically called him his roommate. He said, my roommate, Brian, by the way, Brian was about 300 pounds, a foot taller than Stid, and could totally whip his ass. He said, my roommate, Brian, found the whiskey and drank it all before I got home. And they said, okay, well, if Brian stole your whiskey while you weren't there, why do you look like this? He said, Head, if somebody steals my whiskey, somebody's taking an ass whipping, and I don't care if it's got to be me. And by that, he meant, he had, if he let people run over him, if he let people offend him, if he could continually just looked away and turned the other cheek at the insults that were delivered to him and let people steal from him, that they would just keep doing it. And I think that's where Putin is right now. Even if he has to take the ass whipping, now we have really not much clue from Western media about what's really going on in that war. Think of all the lies you've been told in the last 2 years about COVID, and then use that filter to apply to what you're being told about what's going on there. But it does look like Putin is suffering some major casualties and losing a lot of equipment over there. But at the end of all of this, the West will declare a victory in our media, and Putin will declare a victory in his media. And the reality is it could have all been avoided if we had followed some advice from some very sage people starting back in the 90s, who said that what we are doing, basically the Cold War is over, but what we're doing is going to wreck Ukraine. And I've been saying this too, this shouldn't be a custody battle for Ukraine. This shouldn't be it's up to them to determine what they are, but if it's going to be stable, I don't think they should be part of a European Union, and I don't think they should be part of a Soviet Union. Henry Kissinger described it as a bridge between Europe and Russia. And, by expanding NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we sort of brought this upon ourselves in some way. Our deep state, our State Department, our CIA does a lot of hard work to try and determine who's going to be the leader of these various countries. But it's actually our policy that helped Putin come to power. NATO is a Cold War relic, and Russia responded by electing a Cold War relic, Putin. They still have national pride. It was a blow to their pride for the Soviet Union to dissolve. But at that point, instead of expanding NATO, we should have, worked to build bridges with them. But we didn't. And so that's what sort of brought this upon. And it was totally unavoidable. And there were a lot of sages at the time who said this was unavoidable. There was an article by Eric Black, and he quoted someone who was called the architect of America's successful containment of the Soviet Union. This gentleman was George F. Kennan. He said, and this was in the 90s, I think it's the beginning of a new Cold War. This is about the expansion of NATO. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it's a strategic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. The expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. NATO expansion was simply a light-hearted action by the Senate that has no real interest in foreign affairs. What bothers me is how superficial and ill-informed the whole Senate debate was. I was particularly bothered by references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. So Kissinger and Kennan, they told us that this is where we would end up if we insisted on doing this. I want to talk a little bit about NATO, and this gets me into, because it gets me into the next topic I want to talk about, which is Congress has the authority, the sole authority, to declare war. And this also means to make acts of war. And everybody's always trying to find a loophole to exploit, to say that, no, this treaty obligates us to war, or this agreement here obligates us, to mutual defense. So let me go line by line and address some of those. The first one that we heard about, even before Russia invaded, when they were building up on the border, was this Budapest Agreement. So I thought, well, I need to get this Budapest Agreement and read it. So I looked for the list of all of the treaties that have ever been ratified, and it wasn't in that book. So I found a list of treaties that haven't been ratified yet, because some are still waiting. It wasn't in that book. Then I found this really thick book of executive treaties. Now, this is a contrivance, but they do exist. In the 50s or 60s, Congress I don't believe they had this power, but they basically said that the executive branch can enter into treaties. And so there's a big, thick book, hundreds of pages of executive treaties that have been entered into. The Budapest Agreement was in none of these books. It was signed by nobody of consequence. But let's look at what it says. By the way, the Budapest Agreement was an agreement that was made when Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal that was left over there, left from the Soviet Empire. There's no such like mutual defense agreement in there. It basically says that we won't attack them with nuclear weapons if they give up their nuclear weapons. There's no obligation to defend them by anybody who signed that agreement. In fact, you might argue we violated the Budapest Agreement because the first line in the Budapest Agreement says that we will respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, that we won't meddle with their boundaries or their borders or their government. But what did we do in 2013 and 2014? We did just that. So you could argue if the Budapest Agreement has any binding sense whatsoever, maybe we like to consider ourselves gentlemen and gentleladies, and we would honor this agreement even though we don't know who signed it, and it has no legal authority. Well, if we were going to honor it, we wouldn't get involved in Ukraine because that was the first promise in it. The second loophole everybody thinks they found in the war powers of Congress is this NATO Article 5 provision in the NATO treaty that says that we're mutually obligated. If one country's attacked, then all of the other countries have to respond to that attack. But guess what? There's more articles than Article 5 in the NATO treaty. What does Article 11 say? Article 11 says that the provisions of this treaty will be carried out in accordance with the constitutions of the respective members. So in other words, the NATO treaty acknowledges that you can't violate our Constitution and go to war. It's got it right in there. By the way, I don't think they could have ever gotten it passed when they did if they hadn't put that provision in there. Otherwise, it's not constitutional. So that's in there. And then the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which itself is unconstitutional, but it's law. It was passed by both chambers, vetoed by the president, but the veto was overridden. I personally think it gives too much implied power to the president, but Title 50 of U.S. Code, Section 1547 of the War Powers Resolution says that treaties can't obligate you to war. Like, it says no treaty before 1973 and no treaty after 1973 can obligate the U.S. government, the U.S. people to war. So here's, there's at least three places where they think they've found a loophole, a legal loophole, an obligation, a treaty somewhere, but none of these exist. And so they should all be flatly ignored. Now, there are a lot of people, it's almost not even worth mentioning, but I do have to mention it because some of my colleagues want a no-fly zone. Obviously, if we implement a no-fly zone, we're co-belligerent. We may be already, but if we do the no-fly zone, we're obviously co-belligerent. This involves shooting down Russian planes. By the way, when was the last time that we were told we should engage in a proxy war with Russia in another country? The last time that I remember, because I entered a resolution in Congress to try and stop it, was in 2013 in Syria. Does anybody remember that? They said that we should have boots on the ground in Syria. Obama was advocating for this. John Boehner was fine with it. He said, bring it here and we'll pass it. And at the time, there's another analogy here. We were told, don't worry, they're moderate jihadists. Okay, we're going to team up with these moderate jihadists, which, by the way, eventually became not so moderate jihadists and started roving the countryside after we disrupted things more so than already was. But in 2013, we were told that, by the way, those were moderate jihadists. Now we're told they're moderate Nazis, right? So don't worry about these Nazis. They're very moderate. They're a new kind. They'll be very polite, very kind, And the same thing was told to us in 2013 about the moderate jihadists. But in 2013, I introduced H.R. 2507, and I called it the War Powers Protection Act of 2013, not to protect the War Powers Resolution of 1973, but to protect our Constitution. And it basically said no funds made available to the CIA, to DOD, or any other agency or entity of the United States shall be expended for the purpose of or in a manner which would have the effect of supporting directly or indirectly military or paramilitary operations in Syria by any nation, group, organization, movement, or individual. You have to try to include every word you can because they're going to try and find some loophole in it. Now, we didn't get this passed, but we got similar riders put on appropriations bills which were promptly stripped out. And Congress, fortunately, in 2013, did not vote to go to war. We didn't have a vote. There was going to be a vote, but the people rose up. They knew it would be a bad idea. They made phone calls to congressmen, and eventually, that was in August of 2013, that vote didn't happen. That vote did not happen. So what did our government do? Well, according to the New York Times, and I have to say it that way, we entered into a $1 billion a year clandestine proxy war in Syria that, funding these polite jihadists. So we've seen this before, and so we should be recognizing it now. But I believe that NATO is obsolete. NATO became obsolete when the Soviet Empire fell, and expanding NATO, you have to, the people who advocated for that have to take some responsibility. I'm not saying Putin's not responsible, but you have to accept some responsibility for doing things that led up to this. And if I could, we would dissolve it tomorrow, at least get the United States out of it. This notion that American taxpayers should be conscripted into the defense of Europe is ridiculous. Look, also, if we believe the media and that this small country of Ukraine has single-handedly held off the entire Russian military successfully, then why do we need to subsidize Germany to protect them? I mean, surely they are at least as competent as Ukraine. So there does, and here's another thing that's become sort of patently obvious. Some people think we are in South Korea, that we have 25,000, 30,000 troops in South Korea to protect the South Koreans from North Korea. How ridiculous is that? South Korea has a bigger economy than Russia. It's 50 times, their GDP is 50 times greater than North Korea. So as you observe the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, try to imagine a conflict between North Korea and South Korea. It would be, I mean, there would be a lot of similarities. There would be bloodshed. There would be wasted lives. There would be destroyed infrastructure. But they would not, there's no way that North Korea could take over South Korea. So this battle has shown that not only is NATO obsolete, but that several other of our interventions and engagements around the world are obsolete. This counter here, is this when I'm supposed to stop speaking and take questions? Or, because I want to leave some time for questions, but if I have more time, I would like to speak about the sanctions that have passed in Congress. These eventually also lead to war. Sanctions will lead to war. First, I'll start with the most controversial point on sanctions, the one that the mainstream media would disagree with, is that you empower Putin when you punish the people that are underneath of him. Like, we need to win the hearts and minds of the Russian people, but when they see the prices go up, when they can't get medicine, when they can't get access to basic things, and life becomes hard, they are going, because they're watching the media that Putin's giving them, Netflix cut off subscribers, and like that's going to end the war somehow. The last thing you should do is to cut off images of the Western world that are being broadcast into Russia. But that wasn't a government action. That was a private company. They can do what they want. They probably did it because they were losing money, because the credit cards were canceled in Russia. So it was just mostly a virtue signal. But the real things that our government are doing are going to hurt the people of Russia. At the same time, they're going to hurt people here. We import $1 billion of fertilizer from Russia every year. Take that off the fields in the United States and see what that does to crop production, to prices, to supply, to the supply chain. It's not going to be pretty. And farmers are deciding right now already. I mean, fertilizer is 3 times what it was a year ago. I have a farm. I've decided not to fertilize this year on my hay fields. But there are other farmers making these decisions right now. Okay, I'll get 2/3 the yield, but I won't have to spend 3 times the money on fertilizer. We'll just tough this out. That's not going to have a good outcome in any field, whether it's hay or corn or soybeans or anything. So the sanctions are going to hurt people here in the United States. But the other problem with the sanctions that we passed, there was a strongly worded resolution that condemned Belarus and advocated for regime change in Belarus. Like literally, we passed a resolution in Congress that says there needs to be regime change in Belarus. And we're not even done with Ukraine or these other countries. We've already declared that we need another country with regime change. That was another reason not to vote for these sanctions. And then finally, the sanctions gave the president way too much authority. They expanded it not just to Belarus, but to the entire world. Now the president, not just this president, any president forever, because they also took off the expiration date of the Magnitsky Act, the sanctions don't just apply to Russians or Russian oligarchs. They apply to anybody that the president says has violated civil rights or anybody who is corrupt. And when you think about this, they're not going to drag those people into American courts. They're going to drag Americans into American courts if they violate the sanctions. The sanctions are really creating crimes that will be prosecuted against Americans. I don't think everybody's thinking all of this through. So in any case, there's a lot of reasons that led up to this, and we're going to end up kind of where we were, but with a lot of wasted life unnecessarily. And the sanctions are bad, and I will stop now. I don't know what this timer means at all, and I will stop and take your questions. Thank you very much. And I'll let somebody else decide who's going to ask the questions.
So for the question and answer period, Declan and I both have microphones at opposite ends of the room. Raise your hand if you have a question. We'll ask you for the gist of it briefly, and then we'll hold the microphone out as you ask the question. I suppose I'll get it started here if nobody's got anything yet. Congressman, have you heard from your constituents on the war in Ukraine? And if so, what have you heard?
Well, I have heard a concern from farmers. Kentucky, is the district I represent, has agricultural interests, and they're very concerned about the price of fertilizer when I point this out to them. They're kind of sort of holding their powder. It's not like it was in Syria where people sort of had this visceral reaction and didn't want to get involved in another war. But it's hard for them to get information. I hear from both sides. I hear people who are believing the propaganda and saying that we need to get involved, that we should have a no-fly zone. They're watching the TVs. And then I'm hearing from people who say to stay out. But it's a mixed bag right now. I see a few hands, but...
Have one back here.
Hi, good morning. Augustus Salzona here. If you were President of the United States right now, what would you do regarding the Ukraine-Russia war?
What would I do? Well, I wouldn't say that, we need regime change in Russia. I'll just start with that. That was a ridiculous statement from our president. I think primarily we should stay out. President Trump said that Europe needs to pay its fair share of NATO. I would say that fair share is 100%. Like, the fair share for Europe to pay for their defense would be 100%. I would do sort of what Trump said about NATO, but I would go further and say that we shouldn't be contributing to it at all. And I would not be trying to expand NATO in more countries. That would be wrong. What would you do? Same thing, okay.
Same thing. Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. I would also try to, like I said in the beginning, I would try to make us more energy independent. I'm not against free trade. I think free trade is great, but I think it's ridiculous when we cripple our own industries. And, the Green New Deal, by the way, have any of you read that? It's 14 pages long, and when I got done reading it, I realized why it's only 14 pages. There's only 64 crayons in that big box. Adopting we're in this Orwellian phase of the unenlightenment period where, a porous mass can stop microscopic particles, where printing money doesn't cause inflation, where you have to redefine vaccination in order to qualify a pre-treatment as a vaccination, where a man is a woman. We're in this period, this unenlightenment period, and I think we're going to feel the consequences of that. If anybody's seen the movie Idiocracy, that's where we are.
We have one over here.
Hi, Congressman, could you characterize the sentiment of your GOP colleagues in Congress? I know your view is probably a minority, but how much of one, and how many of them might agree that NATO expansion is the taproot of the crisis, as I do?
I don't think many of them are for dissolving NATO or getting us out of NATO at the moment. But since you mentioned my colleagues, I have to mention one of these surreal moments I had a few years ago when the crisis of the day was Iran. And Obama was president. And some of my constitutionally obligated colleagues, these people felt a deep conviction of the Constitution, said behind closed doors that we should pre-declare war against Iran in case Obama wants to do it. How ridiculous is that? It was literally a proposal from my colleagues to just go ahead and pre-declare war because the president might need to do it at the drop of a hat. And while we're talking about presidents, there was, if you remember, when President Trump ordered the attack on Soleimani, and there was sort of a mixed bag of reactions to that in Congress. But one thing was for certain, we didn't want that to escalate into a war. At least that was certain for me. And the Democrats introduced a resolution. And in the whereas clauses, they tried to litigate, the Soleimani thing. And Matt Gaetz, a colleague of mine who's very good on this issue, went to the Democrats and said, if you'll take out the litigation of the Soleimani strike and just say, President Trump can't go to war with Iran without a declaration of Congress, I will vote for this. And so he did, and I did as well. There were only 3 Republicans that voted for that. It was a Democrat resolution. I don't want you to think they were principled. They were trying to embarrass the president, but they put a resolution in front of us that I had to vote for. And I got a call from President Trump about an hour before the vote. Somebody had ratted me out and told him I was going to be voting that way, although he probably should have suspected it anyway. And his argument to me, he said, I'm more anti-war than you are. And he said that he could keep us out of a war if we gave him the power to basically threaten war. That the bigger the threat he could promote, the less likely we were to go to war with Iran. That was his logic. I'm paraphrasing. And I said, yes, that's fine, but when they call your bluff, then we are completely obligated to war, and Congress has no authority there. And, I've voted for similar things under Obama, and I'm with you 90% of the time, but on this, I just can't be with you. And he said, well, you're going to get a primary opponent, and even I can't help you if that happens. And the next day, I got a primary opponent, but I beat him 81-19, so I'm still stuck here.
So if there are no more questions from the audience here, let's just give it up for Representative Massie.
Thank you very much.